Next panel is on carbon offsets, and I am just going to do the very briefest of introductions so we can get to the discussion right away, and we also have some time for questions and answers at the conclusion of the panel as well. Our panelists are Justin Baker, who is a senior economist from RTI International, Randall Tolpinrud, who is the president and also the founder of the Pax NATURA Foundation. And we're also delighted to have as our moderator today, Deborah Ross, who is a former member of the North Carolina House of Representatives and a practicing attorney with the firm of Fox Rothschild. Welcome to our panelists.
Well, thanks to everybody for being here. I think we'll have a lot of time for robust conversation because we have fewer panelists. I do want to say that two things that are going to come in to play here in this discussion that we haven't talked about as much right now are money, because we know that that generally determines how a lot of our policy happens, and political leadership and political will. And Randall, who has shown some of it himself, he's run for Congress twice. See, I looked him up. But also has studied countries where there has been the political leadership and the political will to deal with carbon offsets. And sometimes we get frustrated in our local, state, and federal government here in the United States, but he'll give us some hope from abroad. We're going to start with Justin because he will have a more macro look at this and look at the dollars and cents. So Justin, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Make sure I'm on here. Great. Thank you very much, Deborah, and thank you so much to the National Humanities Center for having me today. I'm not going to worry about this microphone too much. I managed to project pretty well. So I wanted to make a couple of quick apologies. First, if I break down into a sneezing fit or, I don't know, otherwise start rubbing my face. The pollen is really taking a toll on me right now. I'm sure others feel the same way. The second, I have to say that last panel was unbelievable. Very, very accomplished speakers, very insightful remarks. You really set the bar very high. I think it's a good time to go ahead and recalibrate expectations, at least for my portion of the talk. So I'm just going to throw that out there. But what do I want to accomplish here today? So as an economist, as somebody who's been working on carbon offsets as part of my career for the last decade or so, I wanted to try to provide at least a very high-level framework for why carbon offsets, or more generally, emissions reductions from the land use sectors, forestry and agriculture, are such an important ingredient of the climate mitigation puzzle. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the emerging literature and what we call the integrated assessment modeling community, a recent IPCC report, some recent work that's really generated a lot of enthusiasm in what is now being called natural climate solutions. 10 years ago, it was all carbon offsets, is always how we describe these things. Now we're talking about natural climate solutions, or more broadly, natural solutions for resource management strategies. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the economic and policy barriers that I see when we're thinking about investing in offsets. There's a lot of enthusiasm right now, and indeed a lot of the countries that have put forth their NDCs and are taking domestic climate action seriously have proposed mitigation or abatement portfolios that fall broadly within what we're defining as offsets or natural climate solutions. So as a bit of background, I started working on this in about 2008, 2009 or so. At the time, I was at Duke University, and we were interested in supporting supplemental analysis for the last major comprehensive climate legislation that had been put forth in the House of Representatives, the Waxman-Markey bill, that ultimately died on the floor in early 2010. But at the time, there were a lot of questions, not just about what the full economic costs of comprehensive cap and trade legislation would be to the macroeconomy, but on various cost containment mechanisms. That is, secondary policies that could be put into place, or policies that fit within the cap and trade legislation that could help contain some of the economic costs or the economic burden that this comprehensive climate bill could put on the economy. And the piece that I worked on was offsets, right? And so, specifically what I was involved in with a team of researchers and collaborators that I won't name all here today, was modeling alternative pathways, emissions reduction pathways in the land use sectors to understand associated economic costs of reducing emissions from activities like rice cultivation or livestock management, forest management, or activities that could help us increase carbon uptake in the terrestrial system through expanding forest area, through afforestation, reducing the amount of grassland that gets converted for crops for cultivation. So this is the kind of modeling that I've been involved in for about a decade. My work at RTI is fairly similar. The policy scope of what I investigate these days is a bit different, but at the end of the day, I'm an economist, and I specialize in working with computational economic models that help us look at potential policy pathways to get to some goal, and sometimes that goal is reducing emissions by some amount. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about offset markets, what we currently see in existing markets, and then this section, understanding the potential, that's tying it back to the recent literature, and then I'll spend a little bit of time, not too much, because I want to get into a group discussion, just kind of going through some of the hurdles that I see, economic and policy factors that warrant consideration. But then I do want to try to inject some optimism into the conversation and talk about some opportunities to move forward and to really pursue climate mitigation in a way that maybe reframes offsets a little bit and helps us move forward and incentivize investment. Okay, so these two tables, lots of information here. I don't expect you, obviously, I'm not going to go line by line here, but I wanted to point out the size of the current offset market in the United States, right? So this is a table from a paper that we put together a couple years ago. And if you look at the bottom line on the left-hand side here, this gives you the total cumulative abatements and the total area or acres enrolled in current offset markets sponsored by ACR, CAR, and VCS related to forest sector abatement strategies, right? So this includes improved forest management, afforestation, reforestation, avoided conversion, and urban forestry. So the reason I put this up here is I wanted to give a sense of the scope that we're talking about here. So 5.5 million acres, that's roughly 2 million hectares. That, if we think about that in terms of the entire privately managed forest resource base in the United States, it's less than 2%, right? If we think about the public and private, managed forest resource base in the lower 48, it's we're talking about 0.5%, right? So this is a very, very small portion of the land base that is currently enrolled in an active offset market. The point being, there is opportunity on privately managed timberland to increase the sale of offsets or to enroll new forest landowners, land managers into these activities for which we have existing markets. The greenhouse gas potential is non-negligible. We're talking about from improved forest management over 1 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year while a project is enrolled, all the way up to roughly 5 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent for afforestation type projects. These are meaningful reductions on a per unit area basis, which is why they're popular. When you look at the projections of abatement potential from the land use sectors, forestry plays a dominant role for a reason, right? Forests have a comparative advantage in supplying offsets through terrestrial carbon uptake in a relatively inexpensive way. So this next figure I pulled from a really nice report from Hamrick and Gallant. It's a kind of a state of the current offset market activity globally. And I wanted to point out that while forestry, if you look at the left-hand side here, you see Red Plus, and you see some old CDM projects, wind and landfill methane. These projects have played the dominant role in offset sales globally. Agriculture, and we see tremendous potential in agriculture in terms of physical potential to provide offsets. Agriculture has played a very, very small role relative to the total global portfolio of investments in offsets. And there's many reasons for that, but I mean, the fundamental factor is that offsets in agriculture are expensive. The price signals right now in existing voluntary offset markets in California and elsewhere, the prices, the CO2 equivalent prices, are too low to encourage investments in offsets for certain agricultural mitigation strategies. That's not always true, but by and large, the price point is fairly low to encourage additional participation in these markets for agricultural producers and for many foresters. Additionality and monitoring, reporting, and verification burdens are quite high when we're talking about enrolling in offset or participating in offset markets, right? Being able to demonstrate that your activity, your offset sale is additional to whatever your assumed baseline is, whatever the protocol states your baseline is, and to take on the additional costs, the MRV costs associated with that project, can provide a burden that's too great for many people that want to participate in these markets, right? So there are some hurdles just given the status of existing carbon markets that are out there and the relatively low prices that we see that have discouraged investments in a lot of these offsets. But we need mitigation from the land use sectors if we want to move forward and advance aggressive climate action agendas that help us stay on track for climate stabilization. So back in October, I believe it was early October, maybe late September, the IPCC released a 1.5 degree special report. And many of you have seen this and have probably seen some of the key findings from this report. What this report did is it issued a dire warning that we need, a fundamental change in our direction. We need a really ambitious plan over the next decade to 12 years to put us on the right path for climate stabilization at or below 1.5 degrees. And what they did is they offered recommendations or pathways, different pathways to help achieve climate stabilization. And within each of those pathways, they identified, the mix of potential technologies, electric power sector developments that we might need to see that would actually put us on this pathway towards net zero emissions by mid-century. So what this figure is showing is current estimates of where we are globally with emissions and where we need to go over the next 50 plus years to stabilize emissions, and note that we fall below zero beyond 2050, meaning we are at net zero or net negative emissions in order to achieve this stabilization target. Okay, so what do I mean by pathways? So the IPCC looked at different options, different suites of alternative technologies or investments that could be made that put different level of emphasis on the role of the land use sectors. And the point that I want to make here is that for most of these pathways, actually for all of these pathways, there is a large envisioned role from forestry, from agriculture, and from other land-using activities to enhance carbon sequestration from terrestrial systems and to provide sources of emissions reductions and to provide kind of requisite biomass that can go into the energy system as material for negative emissions technologies such as biomass with carbon capture and sequestration. Right? This is kind of a fundamental piece of each of these pathways that the IPCC envisioned here. So it's important to note that the land use sectors, if we are to maintain a pathway that's consistent with the longer term ambitions of the Paris Agreement, that we need to start investing in offsets from the land use sector soon, at scale. So what does the IPCC report tell us? Don't really need to reiterate here, but we really over the next decade or so need to start not only increasing the amount of carbon uptake from the land use system, but we need to start investing in these technologies that will get us towards these very ambitious targets or expectations for bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. Okay, let's fast forward, or actually go back even further first to November of 2017. A really nice paper was released in Nature Climate Change, Griscom et al. And this paper really brought back a reemergence of interest in the role that the land use sectors could play in climate mitigation, right? The paper was focused on natural climate solutions. And so using a meta-analysis and data compiled across a very broad range of agriculture and forest sector abatement strategies listed on the far left-hand side of this figure here, the authors put together a spatial analysis and came up with estimates of global mitigation potential by activity set below different CO2 equivalent price thresholds. And the takeaway here is that below $100 per ton CO2 equivalent, which is roughly 5 or more times what the current California market clearing price is, but below $100 per ton CO2 equivalent, the authors argue that you could get up to 11 petagrams of CO2 equivalent from the land use sectors per year in mitigation. So what does this mean? Well, to put that into context, to meet our Paris, our global kind of Paris ambition out to 2030, these results suggest that below $100 per ton CO2 equivalent, if we rapidly invest and deploy in natural climate solutions, we can reach a third of our emissions reductions ambition just from land use related activities, right? So forget about what we're doing to transition our energy system or our industrial system. We can get a third of our potential abatement just from the land use sectors. Okay, so we've seen in 2018, fast forward, there was another paper that came out that just focused on the US. Again, if we think about the abatement potential being shown here, it's roughly, it's enough to get us almost all the way to our Paris agreements of our Paris, previous Paris declarations of 26 to 28% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. It's a very large amount of mitigation projected from just the U.S. land use sectors at or below $100 per ton CO2 equivalent. However, so that's the optimistic pitch. We can do this if we're willing to pay for it. These activities could play a vital role in our emissions reduction future and help us to stay on a pathway for climate stabilization. But of course, as an economist, the answer is always it depends. And so there are some important economic considerations before everybody gets too excited about carbon offset potential or natural climate solutions, right? And so I'm just going to go through these quickly. I've got some examples from some recent research that we've conducted, but I'll kind of save that and might inject some of that into the Q&A session later. But I did want to go through a few of these that I think are important. So anytime we're thinking about the economic costs of mitigation, be it for a single activity from the land use sector or for a suite of activities, we're talking about kind of marginal abatement costs. That's the term that economists and policymakers like to use. We can't assume that these costs are constant over time or constant over space, right? There's a lot of heterogeneity in how we think about economic costs associated with these activities. And so when we see papers like the Natural Climate Solutions work or like some other literature estimates that have come out recently that kind of have this price threshold and in a lot of cases are assuming sort of average cost availability for certain technologies or land use strategies, that doesn't always play out. It could be that these costs actually increase dramatically over time as we invest more and more resources into land-based mitigation strategies, and that's something that's really important to consider. Spatial variation, right? Our regional mitigation portfolios that we think about in a very static sense, if we have information on costs and know locations and spatial extent of where activities are available, that's one piece of the analysis. The other piece of the analysis is saying if we have a fixed budget or a policy incentive, how might that drive investment in Brazil versus the U.S. versus Southeast Asia? So spatial considerations and understanding how spatial portfolios, abatement portfolios might change under different economic or policy conditions is something that really comes out a lot in my work and something that I think about a lot, and I think it's absolutely critical. We can't just assume kind of constant abatement portfolios in different regions over time. Exclusivity, right? We can't look at individual mitigation options, so RED plus, landfill methane, excuse me, not landfill methane, methane reduction from livestock operations, rice cultivation emissions. We can't think about these as being sort of exclusive mitigation options. The land use sector is so highly interconnected and dependent that we have to think about these opportunities holistically. And I can get into that in a bit in the Q&A. And then, of course, there's other market considerations that just make this stuff really difficult and costly, right? There's the permanence factor. When you're an investor purchasing an offset, or just investing generally in an emissions reduction strategy, you would like that to be a permanent emissions reduction, right? But if you're investing in an afforestation project, there's no certainty that that is a permanent emissions reduction or a permanent increase in sequestration, right? Those trees could be caught in a fire. They could be cut down. There's a number of things that could happen that could make this an impermanent investment. Additionality that I've mentioned already, uncertainty, just not understanding the carbon cycle at a fine local scale well enough to accurately invest in a mitigation strategy. Leakage, right? So what I invest in the United States has implications for how land use is managed in Brazil, right? This leakage has been a fundamental argument in the policy debate surrounding corn ethanol and other sources of biofuels. And when we think about large-scale investments and offsets from agriculture and forestry systems, leakage will be part of the conversation there as well. But I do think at the end of the day there are some real opportunities here. I think the work that I'm involved in with collaborators is actually quite optimistic on the role for forestry and agriculture. We show pretty substantial mitigation potential at a global scale without raising too many alarm bells regarding food security implications. We also show that complementary investments, for instance, thinking about bioenergy systems holistically with carbon sequestration policy incentives, can actually be a win-win, both for carbon and for emissions reduction in the energy sector. And we also show that because you have this interdependency between agriculture and forestry, if we think about mitigation policy design that targets emissions reductions holistically as opposed to an activity-by-activity basis, that can actually increase the efficiency of our investments. So we get more mitigation for fewer dollars invested. And that could identifying these opportunities, I think, can encourage investment. And so I'll just kind of leave you there with a bit of a positive note.
And that was very technical, but I think somewhat hopeful in the end. And I'll just interject before we get the very hopeful example of what the world could be doing, that when these technologies are new and when there has to be an economic investment, it's very hard to get them off the ground. So one of the things, and I was actually talking to my seatmates there, one of the things that I do as a lawyer is work on renewable natural gas in North Carolina and finding a way to turn swine waste and poultry waste into energy. You can do that, but then the question is, what kind of infrastructure do you have to invest in to get it to be where it's got to be? And these are great ideas. They're done in other countries successfully. But here in the United States, we're used to doing things the way we've always done them, and somebody is going to have to invest in them. And usually that's not going to be the government. It's going to have to be the private sector coming into play. And so we need good economists to tell us where we might have our big wins at the beginning, so that maybe we can carry that momentum. But we're going to turn it over to Randall to tell us about smaller countries that might inspire us to do better. How's that?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Justin, for the big picture, and very much appreciated. Is this working okay? I don't know whether I should get closer or...
Yeah,
too close? Okay. Can you hear me okay? All right. One quick note before I start, just because his presentation just triggered a quick note. And that is that at Katowice, COP24, the UNFCCC gathering just last December, a group representing $32 trillion in investment capital gave a very interesting, forceful talk to 195 Conference of the Party nations in attendance. And by the way, there's another side issue. It's the first time in human history where the entire world has come together to formulate an agreement to deal with one thing. And that's no small accomplishment. But this group told those 195 nations, you must stop burning fossil fuels now. And you must start with coal because investors are no longer going to be willing and are no longer able to assume the risk of climate change for their investments. We've sort of been waiting for this moment, sort of a Pearl Harbor moment, because where the money goes is usually where the policy goes. And so that was a very interesting moment at the conference history. All right, back to the beginning. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And beyond despair, I would like to mention that many of us in Utah have been struggling with moving beyond despair for losing 3 of our greatest assets to the National Humanities Center here in the form of Robert and Vicki Newman and Heidi Camp. And I can tell you they're greatly missed in Utah because they're extraordinary leaders. Yes, I know. Congratulations, you won that one. We miss them very much, but we know they're doing a great job here. So thank you for the invitation to talk a little bit about a very small little piece of the pie, a very small country that's had some extraordinary successes that, in fact, as chance would have it, we decided to document. And so I just finished a 1-month film crew tour of the country with a group from the BBC. And we interviewed the entire top leadership, environmental leadership of Costa Rica. We've established those relationships for the last 20 years working in the country. And the whole purpose of this documentary is to showcase the fact that here's one example. Now, I've learned something in academia, and academics can criticize everything, but I want you to keep the big picture, that here's one little small example in Central America where a country has proven to the world that it is possible, not only possible, but that environmental conservation and economic development are 2 sides of a single equation, and that equation will not balance unless both sides are addressed. So if any of you have ever been to Costa Rica, I'm curious to know if anyone has ever been there. My guess would be you probably went because you wanted to see the wildlife. You wanted to see the birds and the monkeys and things like that. What you probably don't realize is there's decades of work to get to the point where a new industry was born in that country based on their conservation efforts. And that's my job today, is to tell you how that happened. And I think a Costa Rican example is interesting because it's an example in the world of what's going on all over the world. In the early part of the 20th century, it was it was a country that had one of the highest deforestation rates in the world due to extractive industries, Banana Republic, United Fruit Company, and others. And basically, that led to a serious problem with their electric grid because they were losing their watershed because they understood that watershed was critically dependent on the health of their forests. And as their forests were disappearing, so was their electricity grid. What they did not anticipate was what was to come as a result of those first efforts to address massive deforestation and exploitation. So, let's go to, which one of these do I punch here? Do I do this one? Okay, here we go. So my job in the next little bit is, I'm not going to give you a whole lot of statistics, facts, and figures, although we've done several project development documents over the years to be compliant with both voluntary and regulatory markets. We've addressed the issue of additionality and leakage in Costa Rica with a nationally administered program, but I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to give you more of the general idea of how this program has actually worked to great success in the country. But I'd also like to convince you, primarily through their example, not ours, and I want to emphasize Pax Natura's role. We have been very helpful in the technical side of their voluntary RED. We have represented them at the UNFCCC conference. We've represented them at the carbon markets worldwide for quite some time. We did the first RED program in the country, and we got the first international validation, social carbon, Climate Community Biodiversity Alliance validation, and now we're currently working on VERA, which used to be VCS validation, in order to be compliant with the new regulatory regime that came out of Paris in 2015. Well, this tree, it turns out, that I hope to convince you, is worth more standing than it is converted to furniture or cattle pasture or palm oil. And a quote that I like very much is that clearing an acre of rainforest, tropical forest, by the way, carbon, is where we ought to start. A temperate forest, important, but tropical forests contain 5 times the amount of carbon. It takes about 150 to 200 years to perfect the carbon stock in a tropical rainforest. And once that's perfected, they're carbon neutral. What they put into the atmosphere is what they bring back down as a result of natural regeneration. But this is a quote from someone, by the way, clearing an acre of rainforest for furniture, cattle, or palm oil is like bulldozing the Sistine Chapel to make room for a parking lot. And it's not just the economic value, but the Costa Ricans managed to deal with this in a very creative way. But first, the history of RED. Are any of you familiar with RED? Okay, RED is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. And I noticed, Justin, that on your presentation you were talking about reforestation and afforestation projects. And so under the UNFCCC, the UNFCCC was created at the Rio Summit in 1992. And at the first meeting in 1995 in Kyoto, the protocol was accepted for 2 reporting periods, 2028 to 2012 and 2013 to 2020, and that will be replaced by the Paris Agreement after 2020. 197 parties to the convention, and the CDM, or the Clean Development Mechanism, was adopted at this time. Under the Clean Development Mechanism, especially the Marrakesh Accords dealing with agriculture, including forestry, under LULUCF, or land use change, and forestry, only afforestation and reforestation projects would qualify for carbon finance. In other words, the Kyoto Protocol created a perverse incentive to destroy the world's remaining standing rainforests. Because once you cut them and you get rid of 50% of all life forms on planet Earth, that you can't regenerate that by replanting the forests. It takes millions of years for Mother Nature to perfect that. And that biodiversity is rich. And by the way, the Costa Ricans teach their young people bioliteracy. In addition to reading, writing, and arithmetic, they must be bioliterate also to understand that relationship to the natural world. But LULUCF, under the mechanism, and the Clean Development Mechanism is a great idea. And I'm a big, huge fan of the concept, because basically what it said was, Annex 1 nations, in the language of the time, we created the problem. It wasn't Costa Rica, it wasn't Panama, it wasn't China, it wasn't India. It was the United States and European industrialized nations that created the problem of climate change. And therefore, they recognized, everyone recognized at the Conference of the Parties, that we all had a share in the responsibility of helping other nations develop their economies but not in the same way that we did ours. At that point, the science was clear enough to know that we couldn't allow them to burn fossil fuels like we did to develop our economic growth rates. And so a mechanism was put in place to transfer capital and technology into the developing world through the mechanism. The Clean Development Mechanism is a great idea. In other words, in order to lower emissions at a coal-fired power plant in southern Utah, a cap would be set on emissions, and if that plant came in under the market, it could take the spread and take it to the market and sell those credits and create a monetary incentive to lower emissions. That was really the gist or the basis of the Montreal Protocol on chlorofluorocarbons. Created a market-based mechanism. There's been some question about how much that helped that way, but nevertheless, a lot of credit at the time was given to it, and it was the U.S. delegation that insisted on that mechanism being put in place. And so creating that transfer of technology and resources into the developing world to allow them to develop renewable energy projects, efficiencies, fuel switching, to give those companies time to fuel switch, and they could offset their emissions if they went over their cap by buying these credits and transferring money through the mechanism into these other countries. It was a difficult process, and a lot has been learned under the CDM of the Kyoto Protocol. Not enough volume has been created. It's a complex and difficult process. And for the Costa Rican delegation, it was insane to exclude, under the LULUCF, standing rainforests. So what they did, went back home. The guy's name is Franz Tottenbach, who's our forester, Pax Natura forester with Fundacor. And they went back and started the world's first voluntary RED project. All RED projects have been voluntary up until Paris. Reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, or in another term, avoided deforestation. And what they did is they created a program, a federally administered program, with the Fondo Nacional Financiamiento Forestal, FONAFIFO, the primary agency that we work with. And that Payment for Environmental Services program has 4 components to it. And what basically it says is that for a landowner that has some forest, we are willing to pay that landowner to not cut those trees. We recognize the value of those trees from the perspective of carbon sequestration, absorption, fixation and storage. And we also understand that these forests contain a great deal of biodiversity. And we're willing to assess a certain value to carbon, which is about 80 cents of the dollar. That's where the market is in the world. We value the carbon sequestered in that tree or in those trees more than we do right now the biodiversity and the life forms that those forests contain. But it was important to put in, the Costa Ricans felt it was very important to put in the additional value that those standing forests had for the host country and for the local communities and for the world as a whole. So biodiversity protection, they were the first country to develop a bioprospecting agreement with the pharmaceutical company Merck. Now, the Costa Rican people got pennies and Merck made billions. However, it was the first moment when host countries with all that intellectual information, and by the way, the Costa Rican people were the first to do a national biodiversity inventory of the entire country's gene pool. That's the first country to do that. and then take that intellectual property rights and market it so that the people, the host, could get economic benefit to it. Now bioprospecting agreements are more prevalent, but that was the first time. And the third one is, of course, as I mentioned earlier, watershed protection. They recognize that those forests really are crucial for urban and rural and urban use. So a small amount was allocated for that. And the fourth one is an interesting one, protection of scenic beauty for tourism. And that turned out to be quite significant. And so basically, we have now 7,000 people currently enrolled in a nationally administered program which helps address the issue of leakage. We can't be responsible for doing a voluntary RED project in Costa Rica, and then somebody sells the carbon rights or whatever to the program and then moves to another country. But there are these debates that are constantly taking place at the Conference of the Parties meetings about this, and at some point you want to just say, wait a minute, come on now. If we don't start at a certain place and at least perfect that, we can't monitor the whole world at what's going on at the same time, but we can look at that country and assess if it's working or not. And I think in the case of Costa Rica, we have about a 40-year satellite image of the state of the forest cover of that country. And if you'll notice, in about 1983, they were down to 1987, they were down to 21% forest cover from 75% in 1940. So massive deforestation. In 2010, 52.38. Today, it's about 53%. Now, I am not aware of any other country on planet Earth that has been able to accomplish this. Stop the destruction of its primary forest and then add 33% or whatever of its landmass to forest cover. Because they have an interesting situation. We had a fascinating talk this morning about the soils at the farm. And it turns out that the soils in Costa Rica are much better for regeneration than they are in the Amazon basin, for example. And so what's happened is 7,000 landowners involved, and they put their program into the program, and then the neighbors let their forests continue to grow, and there's natural regeneration. And so that's a part of the success story of the project. So as I mentioned, the project validation and verification, VCS validation currently underway. So there's a lot to do in terms of MRV, monitoring, verification, and reporting under the new Paris Agreement. And the Costa Ricans have been at this for quite some time. And these are the agencies. So we have remote sensing, we have ground truthing, FSC standards, the program is really based on that. And our particular partner does the monitoring of the contracts and the writing of the contracts. And then we also had the National Biodiversity Institute who did the world's first biodiversity inventory of the country, that was going to do biodiversity monitoring, and then they made a rather significant mistake and built a project in Santo Domingo that stressed them out a great deal. It didn't turn out very well. It was a bad mistake. So at any rate, the monitoring, verification, and reporting is extensive. And once you enroll in the program, once the landowner enrolls in the program, you have to wait a year, and then you are paid per hectare, per year, an amount to not cut your trees. And so globally, deforestation rate, I've seen that number go from 16 to 20%, but generally speaking, 18% of all global greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation. RED was adopted officially as a protocol to be included into the new regime at COP13 in Bali. And RED Plus was formalized at COP21 in Paris. And I won't go into this because Justin has already addressed this issue. but it doesn't look like anyone really agrees that we're going to be able to meet the 1.5 emissions targets. However, I would like to point out something. A lot of people blame the U.S. for this and our pullout from the Paris Agreement and from the current administration. You all know that. I don't need to go into that. But at Katowice, there was a booth there with an American flag on it, and that party or that particular booth represented 3,600 private entities in the United States, cities, municipalities, corporations, individuals that have banded together. I'm sure you're familiar with it. We met in San Francisco a few months ago. And we are, I'm very proud to say, meeting 90% of our emissions reduction targets that we set under the Obama administration at Paris in 2015, based on these 3,600 volunteers doing work in California and in the cap and trade system there and other parts of the country. So it was really nice having them there. And then Mr. Trump's representative shows up at the end and talks about the importance of developing fossil fuels. And I don't know why he showed up at a climate conference to talk about that, but he did. But, oh, I'm sorry. Okay. All right, so last little thing. It looks like everybody thinks that we're probably going to be looking by the end of the century 3 to 3.2 degrees. And 1/3 of the solutions could be land-based solutions, including agriculture and forest. 50 countries have adopted RED so far. And I wanted to say this, that RED, tropical forest RED, I'm noticing $100 a metric ton CO2. Tropical forest RED is $1 to $5 a metric ton CO2 right now. Start with tropical forests RED in terms of carbon finance, in terms of carbon offsets. It's by far the cheapest, most humane, cost-effective solution to mitigating carbon emissions in the atmosphere, and then move on to all the other wedges of climate change mitigation. 1.5 for RED, $30 to $50 for renewable energy credits, 70 to 120 for CO2 and carbon capture and storage, and nobody's been able to demonstrate clearly what they mean by carbon capture and storage yet. And so Costa Rican innovation, I won't have time to do it. Basically, they abolished their military, put the money into universal health care, education, and the environment, forest conservation, biodiversity conservation, the first national biodiversity inventory, marine conservation, no gold mining, no offshore oil drilling, carbon neutral by next year. And they just had a meeting with the entire country's leadership and declared that they are going to decarbonize their economy and get rid of all fossil fuels by 2050. It's an extraordinary country. So thank you very much.
And So one thing about this panel, we've definitely moved beyond despair. And we have an example, and it reminds me a little bit of the talk last night, that we find our heroes not in traditional places. And so let's open it up to questions.
Thank you for both presentations. Learned a lot. The Costa Rica story is extraordinary indeed and very inspiring. My knowledge on this is very limited, so I'm just going to ask the question from the point of view of entanglements with people who have dealt with it, and it's coming from a position of trying to understand this, because I myself don't understand it. It's a little bit like, so it's coming from a position of critique, but please help me understand. So I'll connect briefly with the extraordinary presentation by Stephanie earlier on garbage, because there seems to be a similar, if not the same, it's sort of a similar thing evolving with regard to forest carbon offsets as it is in case of garbage, that the richer nations fail to or not adequately able to deal with consumption and waste and made the conscious choice to send it down to the global south. The way the forest carbon offset is playing out seems to have a similar trajectory that is playing out, because somehow in the global north we are not being able to deal with emissions reductions at the source as well as the production of it, so things are moving global south. I mean, it's coming, and I'll tell you where, it's not my critique, it's where it's coming from. So 2009, actually 2007, Bali, where COP RED was adopted, the indigenous peoples of Indonesia protested, and one of the famous pictures was they were not even allowed to participate. So they all put on top of their face this UNFCCC. Moving forward, I was in Copenhagen with many of the indigenous delegation from around the world, and in Copenhagen was the first time when a serious critique of RED came, and that came from the Indigenous Environmental Network, and you know, yeah, Tom Goldtooth and others, who at the time presented RED as the largest land grab on the history of the planet. Fast forward to now, last year 600 environmental, social justice, and indigenous and peace organizations sent an open letter to US Congress on adopting the new Green Deal, or urging the incoming Congress to adopt the new Green Deal. And in part of that, one negotiation that was very contentious was to whether to include or not include forest carbon offsets. And the decision within this group of 600 that it was decided to not include. So I'm trying to understand this. And as the story now unfolding in India, is Indian prominent ecologists as well as the indigenous leaders are saying, we are doing this forest carbon offset to offset the emissions of the rich countries, and it is doing very serious damage to India's forests because it's turning into this monoculture thinking. So I'm just trying to understand in terms of, because the Costa Rica story is so extraordinary, how do you know, is there conversation taking place between those at the top, and of course RED Plus is somewhere else, has moved quite a bit and adopted many of the critiques towards solutions. Where are we with regard to conversations among the grassroots with the grass top on this very important issue?
Yeah.
In terms of investment as well.
Well, and I must apologize, my hearing isn't really great, so I missed some of the things you said, but I think I caught the gist of it. The RED has had a rough start, there's no question about it. The issues internationally are corruption, and like you say, they're land grabs, and indigenous peoples have resisted RED vehemently for fear of losing access to their lands and their historical home. And I think that that's not an unlegitimate concern for a number of RED projects worldwide. But I always want to do a couple of things. First of all, Costa Rican RED is quite unique. It's quite unique in the sense that it's a nationally administered program. Land tenure issues took a big stride forward at Katowice. I think there were two big winners in Katowice in terms of offset emissions, and that was women and women and indigenous rights. There's a new platform that was created in Katowice, linking indigenous peoples worldwide, sharing information with Mayans in Guatemala and others in the Bribri in Costa Rica and all over the world, linking ideas about how to restore agroecology and the principles of ecology into countries worldwide. And I have one thing to say to my indigenous friends, and we have the head of the Ute tribe in Utah on our board who travels with us to Costa Rica all the time, and that is, I'm aware of a lot of the criticisms of RED worldwide in many countries, but I'm not aware of any program out there that is working to stop the total destruction of tropical rainforest. And so when I see one example of how they do it in Costa Rica, and all you have to do is demonstrate some kind of land. Now, that's why jurisdictional nested red is becoming bigger. I'm sorry, I'm taking too much time. Jurisdictional nested red is one example of the pushback on that, and that jurisdictional nested red, we're doing one of those in Costa Rica right now. And that links different stakeholders in the lands so that they can get carbon finance. But what good is it to watch those forests disappear while we argue about the technical nature of how we're going to do this? And that's a gigantic question that's still lurking out there.
Thank you for those amazing presentations. I loved them. And some of the things you're talking about in the initial comment on infrastructure, I'm just curious about how you think about scale. Like we're thinking about a big country like a small country, but a country like Costa Rica, and then the example of, making business cards out of banana peel. Like, how big does something have to be viable for business? Like, if Duke one day said, and I recognize this will never happen, it said, all of our toilets will be composting toilets. Like, is that big enough to make a difference? Like, how does scale operate in something like this?
Well, scaling is the key. It's the secret, obviously, and so we are arguing that all the wedges of climate change mitigation must move forward simultaneously. But we're also arguing that by far the cheapest and easiest and carbon-free thing to do is stop destroying the rainforest. You don't burn any carbon to get there to plant new trees. You simply have to just stop cutting them, and that is a massive amount of effort that needs to go in to make that happen. And Paris was a big step forward in terms of getting REDD integrated into the protocol. And now REDD Plus, which takes into consideration the biodiversity and the other aspects that those forests provide. Scaling has to be on all levels. And our foundation is a big time involved in energy efficiency, and we just honored the two women who started the Standing Rock Sioux Nation resistance movement against the pipeline. We gave them an award, and you should have heard their presentations, But that energy issue and energy infrastructure is important to proceed, and so is efficiencies. This building is a beautiful example of daylighting technology way ahead of its time. But that agreement in Paris was a big deal in terms of moving that scaling up, to get all those nations to agree to that. And Christiana Figueres, a Costa Rican woman, got the credit for getting that done. She's a remarkable woman.
Justin, do you have anything to add to the scaling question?
I'll add to, when I think about scale, I'm usually thinking in terms of area. Most of the modeling that I do is, focused on land use. So the scale of investment that we need, globally, to reach these climate stabilization targets is massive. It is very large. It's the size of India. In some estimates, not in all estimates. But I will say that if there's an incentive structure in place that actually pays and provides a financial benefit to landowners, you can see these kind of large-scale land use changes happen very quickly. The Conservation Reserve Program in the United States took about 5 years to get 30 million acres enrolled in a 10-year conservation program. That's is about half of the scale of investment that we would need in the U.S. From a reforestation, afforestation type program over the next dozen years or so. And so I'm optimistic that it can happen with the right financial incentives.
Okay. And I think we might have time for one more question, and that would be it.
Really great presentations. I feel that our society is very individualistic, and yet to me it seems these solutions, at least as I understand them, require big entities, major companies, countries, to make them happen. is there a way that individuals can get involved in this to make a difference?
Well, I think that's where all the change has got to come from in the United States right now, and people banding together. And I think that group of 3,600 demonstrates the importance of doing just that. And, one of the things that's happened in the carbon markets is getting away from the idea of project by project. You do one project here, one project there in a country. And now national baselines. So we're doing a national baseline in Costa Rica to determine rates of deforestation in every part of the country. And so you've got your recognition that each country has to do a national program, nationally administered program. And so individual responsibility is crucial to make things move politically on the policy side, but sometimes we can't wait for that. And so we just have to, we can't wait for the policy side to come. We just have to move forward with it. And I think that Costa Rican example is one example of that. The whole world told them that go fly a kite. We're not going to do this. And they went back and figured out a way to make it happen.
I would add that in North Carolina, there are opportunities to do things. So a lot of things have happened locally, not just with agriculture carbon offsets, but Boulder, Colorado has adopted a carbon offset program. So things can be done locally. But in North Carolina, there are a couple things that are more robust than in most states. One is land and farm conservation. And so we have all these smaller land and farm conservation organizations that are nonprofits. We also have state programs and proposals to increase those state programs. So you have opportunities to advocate for those kinds of things. And then because we're now the number 3 state in the country for some of our renewable energy, we are now having much more robust organizations around renewable energy because there's just a larger constituency for it. And so there are many, many organizations that do this kind of work. Some are of the industry, some are of funders. And so we're fortunate in this state, for those of you who live here, that if you want to get involved as an individual, you can do it in a variety of ways. And I think we'll wrap up with that and thank the panelists who I think did an outstanding job of giving us a global perspective and hope.
Thank you, Justin.